Greetings from Stanford University. I'm Bill Barnett, professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability.
I'm Ingrid Ackermann, an undergraduate in the School of Engineering.
And we have with us here today Professor Sarah Billington from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and the Stanford School of Engineering. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Bill.
Well, it's great having you here. You just ran an amazing conference, and remind us the title of the conference.
Oh, the workshop, it was called Advancing Sustainable Urban Infrastructure.
Interesting. Well, tell us what that's all about.
So it was mostly about bringing together a group of people that are really interested in sustainable cities. And I want to make first a huge shout out to my colleague Jenna Davis, who helped me co-organize this, as well as several other of my colleagues in civil and environmental engineering. We wanted to bring together the community on campus that's interested in cities, because there are people working on cities from every school, actually, of Stanford's 7 schools, and also tried to bring in as many outside voices as possible. So from academia, from industry, from governments, like municipal workers as well, or people working for cities, and a lot of students. And they came from all over the country, and one even came from Korea.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, it was great, and we set it up to have a lot of very small, quick talks. Like everyone gave a 10-minute talk, and then left a lot of time for kind of open floor discussion. And then we had lots of brainstorming sessions as well, so everyone could really get to know each other. And it was just kind of an opportunity to bring lots of ideas out onto the table.
So let's jump into those ideas. Maybe from one of those 10-minute talks, what was a highlight that you now take away from the conference?
One of the things that really stuck out, actually, to both Jenna and me, was on Saturday morning when we had 2 sessions. Let me see if I can remember. They were one was on new models of urban governance, and the other was equity and well-being. And there was a definite theme that ran through them. So I think there were 7 different speakers, but the theme was around what we picked up on was kind of like unintended consequences, or kind of how do you make the invisible visible through your work. So you're trying to do something in a city, let me think of a good example. Oh, well, one example was from Annette Kim at the University of Southern California, who was talking about how climate change kind of equals migration. And oftentimes you'll have climate change, and she was talking in a particular case in China where there was migration from the rural areas because of a lack of jobs, sometimes related to like agriculture from climate change. I think the workers are coming into the city and they end up living in underground apartments that I believe were built for bomb shelter reasons, and they're not perhaps supposed to really be for housing, but she found while she was living there all kinds of advertisements for them all over the city, and she mapped them, and then people are basically living underground. And and they want to live close to their job. They're not actually allowed to be in the city. Or they don't have the papers to be in the city. And so it was one of those situations where there were also apartments where there would be like 30 people in one apartment, just like triple bunk. And you wouldn't really know, except you'd see the shoe rack outside the door. But it's basically kind of invisible. You don't see it. But do you want to make it visible to help them? But they're not actually allowed to be there, so that's not so good. And so there were sort of themes like that. The other theme was like an example from Erica Plambeck's work on batteries, so lead batteries in Bangladesh. And it was, they were using lead, and it was poisonous, and they were really inefficient batteries. But if you try to import the better lead or try to change the batteries, you would change the whole economic landscape, I guess.
Yes,
and a lot of people would lose jobs. But at the same time, they would be safer because they wouldn't be, panning for lead in recycled makeshift recycled places or something. And
Yes.
so it was kind of like, well, do you raise the awareness of that, but then they lose their jobs or they have to move. So that's what we meant by kind of like unintended consequences, or making the invisible visible. Like, we want to, but do we really? Like, they're just some really tricky ethical questions, I guess. And it was, there was
incredible. That's incredible. You think you folks as engineers, we typically think of you as being, pretty straightforward problem solvers, but here you are highlighting some really very human issues.
Yeah, I think there's, civil and environmental engineering has always been for people. And I think, we're providing water, we're providing shelter, now energy, and the infrastructure for society. So I think the engineers, the people that go into that field, are generally people.
Yes.
But there has, I've seen been more and more awareness of how the people are behaving in the systems. And so more like human interaction, like I work in human building interaction, and then, with people that work in human computer interaction. So there's more and more of it. We're actually modeling the people, not just modeling them as bits and bytes.
Yeah. On that note, part of the conference focused on new models for urban governance. Do you mind speaking about what this means and how this integrates into civil and environmental engineering?
So I think one example from there was the one that I mentioned about Erica Planbeck's work. And do you put rules in place to limit the certain types of imports that could come into the country that might actually be better because they'd be higher quality materials. But again, that could displace people's jobs. So that was one example from that session. And then Morgan Edwards from the University of Wisconsin spoke about science and policy solutions for urban natural gas leaks, and sort of raising the awareness of where those gas leaks were. I don't actually remember a whole lot about that. She had a really nice analysis of where it makes sense to adopt certain technologies, or to put in place policies that would promote certain technologies like heat pumps. Like they work in some parts of the country and not in others. And where is it economically viable to put in place? So that was kind of, that was interesting. Yeah.
It's interesting. Just the general topic, too, just strikes me, Sarah, that when I think sustainability, I typically don't think cities. You think about out in the rural areas, and so it probably surprises you to hear me say that, but I know maybe some of our listeners feel the same way. What would you say to us?
I would say, and it's a quote from my colleague Jenna Davis, that our sustainability battles will be won or lost in cities. I think the cities are where we have so much control over what we're doing to the planet. So, 70, I'm not sure if I'll get all the numbers right, but, 70% of energy is consumed there, or CO2 emissions are the highest from cities. And actually, when you're designing cities, right now there's a lot of sprawl, and that just means more and more infrastructure, which is not sustainable. So if we can have a certain density, we can live more sustainably, basically. I think there have been papers that have shown that with a certain density, you can actually reduce the carbon emissions per person.
Oh, that's interesting.
So
actually getting more people living sustainably within a given amount of geographic area is better for the environment.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
The question is then adjusting current infrastructure to make that happen. And that's a big undertaking in
yes, and limiting the sprawl,
right?
I would say, and also though you want to make it humane. So we didn't have so much discussion on that, but I have had a lot of discussions with other colleagues. We didn't have so much discussion in this workshop on this, but I've had a lot of discussions with colleagues about maintaining biodiversity in cities, or in my work, it's sort of like maintaining some sort of access to nature in the built environment, because we need that connection to nature, and we do want to preserve biodiversity for the broader environment as well. So there's, so it's not that we want to just be in these sort of horrible jungles of concrete.
It seems like another topic of conversation was understanding and managing risk. And it looks like this came up in the context of economics, resilience, circular systems, maybe flooding and sea level rise. Did any of these stick out to you, and were there any new insights you learned?
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed learning about some of the modeling work that goes on for sea level rise and flooding in particular. And that was at a very broad level. That whole session was really nice because it sort of started off looking kind of globally, first at flooding, and then there was sort of the economic impact, but of all kinds of disasters that can happen from climate change, so wildfires, flooding, and that actually grew out of more natural disasters like earthquake. And then it got kind of more local to sort of regional risk, and do you design for the same amount of risk in a urban, densely populated region as a less urban? So it was actually an advocating for paying more attention to the urban because of, for example, the horrible destruction we've seen in Turkey recently. So that was kind of interesting. And then it came even more local because we had a talk about Alameda, so from the Alameda Resilience Officer, and just what their real tangible problems were about sea level rise in Alameda and what sort of things they were going to be looking into. They've gotten some grants to build, methods of combating kind of sea level rise or keeping it at bay in the future. So that was really nice. But one of the things that really stuck out for me was that first talk around flooding, because it was showing where the risks were high and where the risks were low. And I was just really curious about, do we want to advertise that there's lower risk in some areas or that it's actually going to get better in some areas? Because you wonder, does that mean they're going to take the dollars away and then maybe not be prepared for something else? And I just thought that was kind of interesting. So we're always seeing where it's going to get really bad, but then we don't see so much about where it's going to get better. And maybe it's fine. I mean, to shift, you shift where you really need it. But it was sort of, you don't want places to get forgotten.
Yeah, one question that has struck me as I'm hearing you talk, Sarah, is that, around the world, cities look so very different. Mm-hmm. And you fly into a place like Sao Paulo, and it seems to go on forever. It reminds me of that Star Wars point where they come in over a planet, and the entire planet is a city. Right, you know what I mean? As opposed to think of your favorite quaint European city that is nicely bounded by rural areas. And across the world, are there areas of the world where cities are doing a better job at being sustainable than other areas?
I would say that cities where there's a very good public transportation system are definitely doing a better job than cities where it's much more reliant on individual cars.
Interesting. As a Californian, I find that especially interesting. I was just 2 days ago riding all over Santiago on the metro. And of course, here in California, then I proceeded to come back to California and get in a car.
Yeah. Yeah. So transportation is big, but also just buildings and building energy. So, our heavy reliance on air conditioning is just one example. In buildings is a huge emitter of CO2. And so, there's also interest in trying to make use of whatever climate you're in, make use of the other types of cooling that you could have. Like you can have natural cooling. It usually has to be kind of a mixed system. But
Interesting. Thanks.
And maybe as one final question, was there any big highlight for you from the conference, a new takeaway, something that you learned that you want to move forward with?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things for me, but this is more personally, is that I've spent 20 years working on building materials before moving into kind of understanding how our choice of materials are impacting our well-being. And I've been doing that more from the standpoint of when you're in a certain space with the design, how is that affecting your well-being? So sort of a field of could be environmental design in the past, and now it's a little bit more human building interaction. But one of the things that I learned that was brought up through this conference as well was an initiative called Design for Freedom. And it's all about, it's one of these things where you're basically making the invisible visible, and that is embedded forced labor. embedded forced labor or child labor in the production of building materials. And for me, working on building materials for so long and caring about their resilience and then their environmental impact and then their impact on people. And now I'm like, wait, it's got an even broader impact on people in that who's actually making them. And that really just opened my eyes to like how we can have more awareness of that kind of embedded forced labor, the way we're thinking about embedded carbon in buildings as well.
That's incredible. So is there a way that a person can, as our listeners, when they're looking for building materials, is there a way that we can find out whether forced labor was part of the process that generated these materials?
So where this came from was one of the speakers, her name was Sharon Prince, and she runs Grace Farms Foundation, and she has a movement essentially called Design for Freedom, and that's exactly what they've done. They're developing a toolkit for identifying or helping designers figure out like the supply chains and figure out where there might be danger of purchasing materials that have embedded forced labor. And there are lots of laws. So my understanding is that there are materials at the border that can't come in because these laws were just put in place, preventing certain materials coming in that are for solar panels, as an example. So there are laws in place, but I think it's really hard to track where the materials come from. Like you buy a product from Home Depot and it's really hard to know like where the ore was mined for that particular part.
Sure.
And so there's just a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of raise awareness on this.
That just is so eye-opening to me. We talk a lot about Scope 3, going beyond the boundary of the organization when it comes to environmental impact, but clearly we have to include the social impact at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, Professor Sarah Billington, Ingrid Ackermann, thank you both so much for being here. And to our listeners, on behalf of Stanford University, until next time. The Stanford Initiative on Business and Environmental Sustainability podcast series is sponsored by the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Music by Charged Particles. That's Caleb Hutzler, Mike Rock, and John Krosnick.